Good evening, everybody. Thank you. Welcome. My name is Karen Tucker. I'm Churchill Club's CEO. We're very privileged to have with us this evening a rock star panel of economists to examine the question, can tech power the next jobs boom? Erik Brynjolfsson, Michael Chui, Enrico Moretti, Hal Varian, and of course our conversation leader on your far left, Mike Mandel. Welcome and thank you very much for being here. And we certainly wish to thank Wharton, San Francisco, for hosting this program in this gorgeous campus, in this state-of-the-art classroom. Thank you very much as well. A brief introduction for our new guests in the audience. Churchill Club is the top independent forum for business and technology discussions in the Bay Area, now in our 28th year. What drives us every day is to encourage innovation, economic growth, and societal benefit. And we do this through the up to 40 programs that we present each year, where like minds can learn and connect with one another. Our next program will be held next week on Wednesday, January 23rd at the Hyatt Union Square up here in San Francisco, called The Privacy Gap. That's a look at trends in privacy to help move the needle on consumer privacy protection while also supporting innovation and economic growth. On January 30, we look at software-defined networking. Is this the next networking revolution? That will be down in San Jose at Ericsson. And then on February 7, we present LiveOps Chairman Maynard Webb and eBay CEO John Donahoe, talking about a new era for work. This is in San Jose at eBay. So we hope you'll join us for at least some of those programs. If you are tweeting tonight, please use the hashtag Churchill Club, and you'll see other Twitter codes in your printed programs. And then let me now call up Doug Cullum, Vice Dean of Wharton San Francisco, to say a few words about what's happening here at Wharton and also introduce our moderator. Doug?
Thanks, Karen. So welcome to Wharton, San Francisco. Let me quickly ask, how many of you have not been here before? Oh my gosh. So let me just very quickly give you a summary of what this place is about. This is Wharton's West Coast campus. The campus actually has been here in San Francisco since 2001. We moved in January a year ago from the Folger Coffee Building to the Hills Brothers Coffee Building. So our lease policy is intact. It's a great facility. I think you have to agree it's got to be one of the best venues in San Francisco. I hear about how they're doing new lighting on the bridge, but boy, the sun sets and it's magical. We're so privileged to be here, and frankly, just happy to see everybody else here too. We are a microcosm of Wharton's main campus in Philadelphia. Our core programs here include the MBA program for executives, which is about 200 students at any one time. This last fall, we started with a cohort of full-time students that came out from Philadelphia to spend a term studying startup companies and venture capital. No surprise. We have executive education, which is a suite of programs that targets managers and executives with companies in the Bay Area. We have entrepreneurship here. We have customer analytics, a whole range of other programs and activities. We're really pleased to co-host this program with the Churchill Club. Karen has an amazing organization. I am so impressed with what has been done by the Churchill Club, and it's just tremendous to have an audience like you guys here this evening. So let me introduce quickly our conversation leader, and who in turn is going to ask each of our other speakers to speak a little bit about themselves and their backgrounds. So Dr. Michael Mandel is Chief Economic Strategist at the Progressive Policy Institute, which is a prominent Washington, D.C.-based think tank that focuses on economic growth, national security, and government policy. Mike's particular focus is on the economic impact of the data-driven economy, the impact of regulation on innovation, and measurement issues connected with globalization and innovation. He is also a senior fellow at Wharton's Mack Center, which is a Philadelphia-based research center that concentrates on emerging technologies and innovation grounded in business. So before that, in the previous 21 years, Mike spent as a journalist at Business Week, where he was named one of the top 100 business journalists of the 20th century for his writings on innovation and growth. So please join me now in welcoming our panel. Mike, I turn this over to you.
Thank you very much. So glad to be in this beautiful facility with this superstar, not just a rock star panel, but a superstar panel of economists to talk about this incredibly important issue. Before really turning it over to them, let me say a little bit about where this topic came from. And this topic really came to me when I was watching the presidential debates. And I was sitting there saying, these guys are talking about coal and autos. How come they're not talking about the internet and technology? How come they're not even mentioning the internet? How come they're not mentioning the contribution of the tech sector to jobs? Wait, what century are we in? And you go and you look at the transcript, you discover that there was virtually no mentions of the internet or smartphones or mobile or tech-driven jobs or pretty much anything that anybody in this room would be thinking about. It was amazing. Now I spend my time in D.C., and of course in D.C. jobs are job number one. And there's little grasp there of the number of jobs being created by the tech sector. And in particular, there's little grasp that this might in fact be what creates enough jobs to lift us out of the jobs doldrum. Let me actually give a few statistics before turning this over to the panel, who will get the honor of introducing themselves. We're being very efficient here. Over the last year, the number of people working in computer and mathematical occupations has gone up by almost 10%, while we've had less than 2% job growth in the rest of the economy. This growth in the tech sector has been both broad and deep. You know, the BLS lets us break it down by race and ethnic group. So you look at blacks, okay, and the number of blacks in computer and mathematical occupations has gone up by 18% over the last year. You look at Hispanics, and do you know what the growth has been there? Anybody want to guess? 50% increase. A 50% increase among people who identify themselves as being Hispanic or Latino ancestry. Computer and mathematical occupations. This is fourth quarter to fourth quarter. What about geographically? I'll give you a couple statistics there. Very, very interesting. Look at help wanted ads. Okay? Over the last year, the number of help wanted ads for computer software engineers in the San Francisco area has gone up by about 50%. Very impressive. In New Orleans, the number of want ads for computer software engineers has gone up by 146%. New Orleans is doing great work down there. Wichita, ads for computer software engineers up by 100%. Oklahoma City, 60%. You look across the country, there's a very broad increase in tech jobs. It's not simply here in the Bay Area. It's not in here. It's not just in Seattle. Okay. So the question we're going to ask tonight to our very, very distinguished panel, and usually when people say this, they sort of, Maybe they mean it, maybe they don't. But in fact, in this case, what I did was I sort of figured out the top people in the country on this topic. I said, oh, we're never going to get all of them. And we got all of them. So here's the question. Okay, thanks. This better? Okay. So here's the question. We have this tech boom. How long? How big will it be? Will it be big enough to carry the whole economy? How big are the spillover effects to the rest of the economy? Is the job-destroying effects of technology bigger or smaller than the job-creating effects? Then we're going to sort of move on to policy questions. Will new applications of technology to areas like health and education create jobs or destroy old ones? I'm about to be accused of bad microphone holding. Okay. There's just too many of me now. Thank you. Okay. What can policy do to affect both tech job growth and the spillover? And the big picture question, have we reached a turning point in the economy? Is digitization going to create a permanent split in the economy between those who have good jobs and those who don't? Or is this really the dark before the dawn? Okay. To answer, or at least address these questions, I'm going to turn this over to the panel, each of whom are going to introduce themselves, speak for about 5 minutes. We'll have a conversation up here, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers from the audience.
Thanks, Mike. I'm delighted to be here. Like you, I'm very happy to be able to be part of this conversation. I also want to thank Karen Tucker and Doug and the Churchill Club for inviting us here. I guess I'm supposed to briefly introduce myself. I'm Erik Brynjolfsson. I'm a professor at the MIT Sloan School. I'm the director of the MIT Center for Digital Business. And I've been working on issues around how technology is affecting productivity, performance, employment for a number of years, most recently especially with my co-author, Andrew McAfee, who's sitting right there, back there in the middle there. He's going to signal when I'm saying the right thing. Stop now. And a group of people at MIT have been very helpful, graduate students and postdocs, called the Digital Frontier Team. I think that the topic we're discussing right now is really the most important one facing our society. And it's the great paradox of our era. You see, productivity is at a record high. Profits have never been higher, both in absolute terms and as a share of the economy. Innovation is roaring ahead. GDP is higher than it has been before. All sorts of good statistics. But at the same time, job creation is lagging terribly. The employment to population ratio has been falling ever since not just the Great Recession, but since the late 1990s. And it really hasn't recovered even as the economy starts turning around. The drop in unemployment has mostly been because people are dropping out of the workforce. And certainly it's not keeping up with the new people entering the workforce. And even the people who are working, the median wages are lower now than they were in the late 1990s. Now that's very puzzling, because I just told you that GDP is at a record high, profits are at a record high. So how can it be that median wages are so much lower? And part of the answer is that as profits have been going up, the share of GDP going to labor has been falling and is at a 60-year low. And I don't know how good the statistics were before that. So there are many reasons why this is happening. Obviously, there's the business cycle is part of the story. Offshoring and outsourcing, regulatory issues, changes in bargaining power and unions and others. But in my view, by far the biggest reason why we're seeing these big changes in the economy is because of the changes in technology, particularly the very rapid advances in digital technologies. With the exponential improvement because of Moore's Law and the related changes in other parts of technology, computers can now do things that they never could before, and the improvements are doubling and redoubling every few years. And that is leading to unprecedented opportunities for wealth creation. And also, unfortunately, a lot of people aren't keeping up with these changes in organization. Technology can substitute for a lot of jobs and make it more difficult to do jobs, just as Mike's microphones were making it more difficult for him to do his job there. It can also help people do their jobs and make them more effective. And in fact, as Mike alluded to earlier, technology has always been creating jobs and it's always been destroying jobs. 200 years ago, about 90% of Americans worked in agriculture. Now it's less than 2%. Now all those people didn't just become unemployed. Technology helped create new industries, new jobs for them to work in, the automobile industry, the computer industry, other things for them to work in. So this is constant churn and turnover as some jobs are automated and new jobs come around. But clearly, the past 10 years has been a little different. We haven't been creating jobs as rapidly as we need to in recent years, and we haven't been creating the demand for labor that in order to keep wages up that we used to. There's probably no worse time to be a worker with no special skills because those jobs are being automated, especially if you do routine information processing. There's probably no better time to be an entrepreneur who can make use of these technologies. And successful as many entrepreneurs have been, I think they're not doing their job fast enough in helping to create even more new industries. Mike mentioned some of the increased demand in a few of those areas, but it hasn't been keeping up in the overall economy. Technology doesn't, this is a very important point. Technology doesn't automatically lift the fortunes of all people. Improvements in technology can increase productivity and generally have. And through most of the 20th century, the increases in productivity were tightly coupled with improvements in jobs and wages. But there's no economic law that says that has to be the case. It's quite possible for technology to make the pie bigger, but for some people to end up having a smaller slice of that pie. And that's what's been happening recently. There have been different sets of winners and losers because of skill bias technical change, capital bias technical change, and what I'll call superstar bias technical change. We can maybe talk a little bit about that later, that some people have benefited in particular. So let me just say in closing that I think that the changes that we've seen in the past decade or so are in many ways just a window on even bigger changes that we're likely to see in the next 10 years, because the one thing that is fairly predictable is that these underlying technologies are only going to accelerate further. Each doubling has a bigger and bigger effect than the previous doublings because it's on a bigger base. So that means that the changes, if the technology changes are larger, we can expect some more radical restructuring and changes in the economy. Ultimately, I think this is going to be good news because it does make the pie bigger and it does give us more opportunities for wealth creation. But the grand challenge that I think we face as a society is coming up with a set of organizations and institutions that can match this remarkable change in technology. We haven't been doing the job yet, but I think that is something that we need to work on.
My name is Michael Chui. I'm a principal at the McKinsey Global Institute, which kind of makes me sound like I should be on Glee or something like that. But, MGI, as we affectionately call it, is McKinsey & Company's research arm, and I lead some of our firm's research on the impact of long-term technology trends. Let me just build a little bit on some of Erik's comments. And Michael, by the way, you do a great job of setting expectations. So the whole rock star, superstar thing, we got to cut that. We got to cut that out. No, I want to say just a few things. One, a bit of a celebration. Number two, a set of challenges. Number three, at least point to some to-dos. So first of all, a celebration. Look, technology and innovation. Look, in the past 30 years, we've created 1.1 billion new jobs globally. That's partly because of technology. It's powerful. About 900 million of those jobs have occurred in emerging markets, mostly because people are moving from farms to urban centers. Right, over 50% of the world's population now lives in cities, and we know that when people move from agrarian situations to urban situations, in fact, productivity increases. So good stuff. Now, question: will that continue? That's one that I think is open for debate. But a set of challenges. Some of the research that we've done at MGI has shown there is a tremendous, going forward, there will be a tremendous mismatch between supply and demand. So let's take, for example, college educated, right? And it's weird, right? I mean, we sit around at a Churchill Club event. I think most of us went to college. On stage, 5 out of 5 of us have PhDs, right? This is not the real world, right? This is pretty a bizarre situation. If you look at the real world, if you look at how many jobs will require in the world a college education going forward, and compare that, roughly in the momentum case, at current course and speed with the number of people who are graduating, et cetera. In the next 7 years, by the year 2020, we're going to have a gap of 38 to maybe 40 million, 38 to 40 million jobs that will require college education, and we won't have those skills in the labor force.
Is it national, globally, or national?
Globally. In the U.S., it's maybe 1.5 million, is at least one estimate. That's a real challenge. And beyond that, if you actually think in advanced countries, it's about 16 to 18 million. In China alone, it's around 21 million. Right? China, just by itself, is going to have a gap that looks like that. And of course, the other thing is that's just that's everyone who has a college degree. People have talked about STEM before, right? Science, technology, engineering, mathematics. The challenge there, not all college degrees are alike. Apologies to those who have philosophy degrees. I almost got one, but it is a real challenge. If you think about the difference between someone who graduated with a STEM degree and someone who doesn't, their lifetime earnings discounted back as cash flow is the difference between someone with a STEM degree and someone who doesn't is about $500,000, right? $500,000 in difference in earning potential. STEM jobs are growing at 60% faster than non-STEM jobs. If you look at France, you are 5 times more likely to be unemployed if you don't have a STEM degree versus if you do. Right? So that matters. And what percentage of people are graduating with STEM degrees in the United States? About 15%. If we actually have to meet the need for STEM needs in the economy, we'll need to double that, closer to 30%. Is it possible? China graduates about 42% in STEM, Korea about 35%, and Germany about 28%. So it's actually possible, but it's something that we'll have to do, plus immigration. So, other question, is this a problem because of the labor force? Is it because we're all aging out, right? It turns out that, fortunately, the U.S. labor force will continue to grow. Even though it will grow older, we're making enough babies and immigrating enough people that our labor force will continue to grow. So what's the problem? Again, it's a supply-demand mismatch. If you look at people who are, quote, low-skilled. So in advanced economies, we describe those people as people who don't have college degrees, so have high school or lower. In developing countries, we're talking about people with primary or lower. Again, we will have a surplus by 2020 of 90 to 95 million people in the world who have only that level of education versus the number of jobs that will exist there. Right? So that's a big challenge as well. In the United States, it's going to be 6 to 7 million. 6 to 7 million people who don't have the education required in order to get a job. Right? That's a real challenge. So, that's the challenge. Technology, I think, is part of the problem. Right? It's one of the things that's driving some of these supply-demand mismatches. It's potentially part of the solution as well. So, some of the to-dos are simply around providing transparency into what needs actually are there and how can you fulfill those demands. Some of them about how can you actually, educate people in the places and to have the skills that we need them to have. But we also need to create demand. We need to create jobs for people who don't have post-secondary education as well. And so thinking through that is something else that we can discuss. So, Enrico?
Thank you. My name is Enrico Moretti, and I am a professor of economics at Berkeley. I mostly work on the labor market, and I just published a book titled The New Geography of Jobs that tries to answer kind of the question that we are discussing tonight. The question is, can tech power the next jobs boom? And my answer is, it depends.
Are you an economist or a consultant?
It depends on geography. It depends on where you live. We tend to think of the U.S. labor market as one unified labor market. But the reality is that there are 300 labor markets in this country, one for each metropolitan area. And they have very different dynamics. There's a group of cities that over the past 20, 30 years has done remarkably well, much better than the rest of the U.S. It includes cities like here, the San Francisco Bay Area, or Austin, or Raleigh, or Seattle or Boston or DC. And what these cities have in common is basically two things. One is they have the highly skilled labor force. They have workers, a labor force where the average worker is much better educated than the rest of the nation. In fact, at least 40 or 45% of workers in the city have a college degree or more. Okay. And the second thing they have in common is that they have a large number of highly innovative employers. High tech, of course, but not just high tech. Innovation takes many forms, and it touches finance, it touches marketing, entertainment, and many parts of the labor force. Now, in these cities, workers are extremely productive, extremely innovative, and have among the highest salaries in the world. The gap with the rest of the other cities has been growing for 30 years and keeps growing with every passing year. And just to give you an example, in 1980, a college graduate in Austin was making slightly less than a college graduate in Flint, Michigan. By now, the college graduate in Austin is making almost twice as much as the college graduate in Flint, Michigan. Remarkably, this is also true for workers who have lower level of education. So a high school graduate in Austin was making much less than a high school graduate in Flint in the 80s. Back in the 80s, Flint was flush with a lot of blue-collar jobs for that type of skills. Today, the high school graduate in Austin is making more than twice as much as the high school graduate in Flint. And the gap keeps growing. To me, this is almost the most interesting part of the story, is the fact that the economic success of these high-tech, high-innovation centers with a lot of high-skilled workers benefits not just the high-skilled workers who work in high-tech, but also benefits the broader community at large. And part of the reason is that is what in the book I call the multiplier effect, is the fact that the vast majority of us will never work in high-tech. Even in a place like Silicon Valley or San Francisco, the number of workers in high-tech is a small fraction of the workforce. The vast majority of us works in local services. In fact, the typical number for a typical city is 60 to 70% of jobs are in local services. These jobs are a diverse set of jobs that include anything from the taxi driver, the waiter, the hairdresser, so jobs that don't require a lot of skills, but also the doctors, the nurses, the lawyers, the architects, and so on, the teachers. Now, these jobs, if you look at the data, they do particularly well, and their salaries do particularly well in cities where there's a lot of high-tech workers with a lot of salaries to spend and to buy these local services. My estimate suggests that for each high-tech job in a metro area, 5 additional local service jobs are created in the long run in that metro area. So for each software engineer at Twitter in downtown San Francisco, 5 jobs for the taxi driver, the therapist, the dog walker, and the doctors and the nurses are created in San Francisco. Ultimately, for these cities that are lucky enough to have a thriving high-tech sector, their prosperity really hinges upon the high-tech sector, but not because the high-tech sector will ever employ the majority of workers in those cities, but because those cities have wealth that is large enough to support the vast majority of jobs that will never be in high-tech, but will always be in local services. And so every sector has a multiplier effect, but the high-tech sector is the largest of all. As I said, it's 5 by my estimate. When you look at the multiplier effect for manufacturing, is 1.6. So a community that attracts one software engineer can support way more jobs outside high-tech than a community than attracting one manufacturing job. And I think this is something that is often lost in the policy debate, and there's a focus and obsession with good blue-collar jobs. The reality is that those jobs are falling, they're not coming back, and that they're not, their multiplier effect is much weaker and so they're not benefiting the community at large.
Why is the multiplier higher? Is it because
It's a great question.
high-tech people make more money?
Yeah, there are three reasons. One is because high-tech people make more money, and therefore they have more money to spend on therapists and hairdresser and waiter.
They need the therapist.
For sure. Well, actually, ironically, they also consume more of their income on personal services. The share of income they spend on personal services increases with income. So the second reason is that high-tech companies themselves consume a lot of local services, everything from the janitor to the IT lawyer, and they basically go. And the third reason is that the high-tech sector is highly aggregated. So there's this clustering effect, whereby when you start attracting high-tech firm, you're going to attract even more high-tech firm in the future. And that means even more jobs outside high-tech in the future. So to me, the real question is how can we foster those high-tech clusters that are increasingly accounting for a larger and larger share of the U.S. GDP, and how can we help the cities that don't have those high-tech clusters, the Flints, the Detroit, where a small fraction of workers have a college degree and very few companies are innovating.
I'm Hal Varian. I'm the chief economist at Google and former professor at Berkeley. If we look at this noise coming out of Washington about jobs, the problem with the Washington View is that everybody wants more jobs and less work. And what they mean by more jobs and less work is I want to get paid a lot of money for doing something that's really fun. Right? I mean, don't we all in some sense? So my grandfather once told me, if you love what you do, you'll never have to work a day in your life. And it's true. I venture most of the people out here really enjoy their jobs. But of course, that's not true for all people. Some people are doing unpleasant jobs they don't like, and they would like to work less. And if we look at these unpleasant jobs, technology, by and large, has displaced a lot of those jobs that were just not very enjoyable. So 200 years ago, people worked 60 hours a week. 100 years ago, it was 50 hours a week. 50 years ago, 40 hours a week. It's now, I think, about 37 hours a week. Look at retirement. That's a very important issue as well. There was no such thing as retirement up till roughly 100 years ago, and then very, very few people actually lived long enough to retire, and now people can anticipate retiring at a fairly young age by historical standards. In fact, if you look at the UAW, I used to teach at the University of Michigan, and the UAW workers had this slogan, 30 and out. They wanted to go to work in the auto factories at 20, retire at 50, and then they'd have leisure for the rest of their lives. Didn't quite work out for that way, as we know. Now, if you look back at what economists have said about this, two economists who've written about this were Marx and Keynes. And Marx wrote about what life would be like under communism, because he argued communism would be so hugely productive that people would just have a great deal of leisure time and they would live like country gentlemen, if you read his description. And Keynes wrote about it when he looked at the economics of our grandchildren, where he said capitalism is so productive that in the age of our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, people will be able to spend most of their time in leisure. In fact, I think it's an interesting question of why we work as hard as we do, because it's certainly true that you could live the lifestyle of a median person in England in 1920s or 1930s by working a day or so a week at current wages. And yet people decided to work the 37-hour, 40-hour work week and consume a lot more than they anticipated 50 years ago. In fact, if you look at the descriptions that Keynes wrote about what life would be like in the future, it looked a lot like Downton Abbey, as a matter of fact. And in fact, we all know Downton Abbey. You have these wealthy aristocrats, and you have these very hard-working servants. The aristocrats seem to change clothes, 4 or 5 times a day, and eat a lot of food, and go hunting and picnicking, all these things. Well, that was what life would be like, yeah. Now, of course, you say, but we don't have servants. Well, no, we do have servants. We have a lot of robotic servants, for example. We have dishwashers. We have vacuum cleaners. We have washing machines. We have taxi drivers who are providing the same kind of services that were provided to those Downton Abbey people. Technology has made the cleaning, the washing, the laundry, all those things much, much more efficient, and so you didn't have to have as much labor component to provide those household chores. You could do a lot of it by machine, and that's exactly what all of us have done. And in fact, if you think about the hard-working cook down there in the kitchen, well, we all have cooks. You know, the highest profit margin, or most supermarkets make their money out of the prepared food because you're always buying the prepared food at the supermarket. Or, of course, if you live here in San Francisco, you go out and eat at some of those wonderful restaurants that Enrico was talking about. So we have cooks. It's just that instead of having a single cook per household, the technology has made the cooking process so much more efficient that you have single cooks that serve many customers rather than just one family. I think I was talking with some friends earlier today about this model of service work that's partly robotic and partly human. They were telling me the hot occupation in San Francisco now is household manager. So you can get your own Mr. Carson or Mrs. Hughes to manage your household. If you've got a double income and kids, that's going to be a great relief to pay somebody, probably a fairly substantial salary to come to your house one day a week. So instead of having Mr. Carson and Mr. Hughes furnishing this single household, you'd have a household manager who would service 5 or 6 households. You've got the economies of scale in managing the households. You've got the experience. You've got the knowledge. It's a lot more efficient to perform that kind of task through that model than it is to do it from the Downton Abbey model. So I think we're going to continue to see exactly the kind of story that Enrico said. There will be some people who are doing high tech, or let's say high education work that demands high education. There'll be a lot of other people providing services for that group, but it's not sort of menial service in the sense that you would normally think about it. It tends to be high-level professional service, which can be very good jobs.
Okay, I've decided to sort of throw out some of the questions I was going to ask this panel. Listening to them has brought a completely different question to my mind. Okay, if I look out 10 years from now, okay, and you talked about the transformation from agriculture and to manufacturing, okay. So if we think, and Enrico, you sort of talked about how the cities, the metropolitan areas which are sort of tech-based, are growing faster and are stronger than the ones that aren't. Okay, and you talked about how we were generating a lot of jobs that we don't have enough people to fill. Okay, and so the question is, if we looked out 10 years from now, are we sort of looking at an economy where the tech sector, broadly construed, is a much bigger share? Is that kind of where we're going? And you can define this any way you want. I'm thinking about, what our transformation looks like. And, you were saying, Hal, that maybe, Enrico, maybe Washington is barking up the wrong tree here. Maybe the growth sectors of the economy now really are the growth sectors of the economy. And that this is, in fact, where the new jobs are going to be. It's going to take us a while to sort of catch up. We'll generate some of the service sector jobs that come around with. So I'm asking you to kind of visualize in the medium term the 5 to 10 year frame that the CBO uses to sort of think about budget. Okay?
Yeah. So let me take a cut at that. And I think the tech sector is certainly a huge growth sector. It's growing in share of GDP in terms of what it's contributing. Employment, as you mentioned, is growing. But I think we also have to keep it in perspective. It's still a very small slice of the economy, and you can create an enormous amount of value in tech without a lot of jobs, per se. That's not a bad thing. I think Hal's exactly right. I mean, the goal is not to create more work, per se. It's to create more value. But specifically to your question of job creation, just consider this. Hal's company, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, you put them all together, and they add up to a little less than $1 trillion in market cap. That's quite a bit. Andy did a nice blog post where he then looked at the jobs, Andy McAfee, the jobs that were created by that, and it worked out to be 186,000 jobs total for all of that wealth creation. Now, I'm not saying that's bad news. That's great that they're that productive and that efficient, but 186,000 jobs is maybe about what the U.S. economy needs to create per month in order to keep up with population growth and keep the employment to population ratio constant. So it is growing. It's growing fast, but I don't think we're going to be creating 4 companies like that per month going forward. And so by itself, that is not going to be a dominant share of the job ratio. That said, technology can create jobs in lots of other areas and can simplify the way work is done in lots of areas, and in areas like healthcare and education and retailing and manufacturing.
You're not so optimistic about where.
Well, no, I just think that it's not the right way to look at it is to look at specifically narrowly in the tech sector. It should be looking at what technology is enabling in other sectors.
Anybody want to add anything, please?
Sure. If you look at the last 20 years, jobs in the internet sector or software or pharmaceutical research, they've grown much faster than the rest of the economy. They've grown, depending on the sector, between 5 to 10 times faster than the rest of the labor market. Will they ever be the majority of jobs? No, I agree with you. They're always going to be a minority of jobs. But that's okay, because the majority of jobs will always be local services. 70% of the jobs will always be local services. What we need is to fill up the 30% of the jobs that create the wealth that is spent on local services. Okay, it used to be manufacturing. At its peak, manufacturing employed no more than 35% of the U.S. workforce. So even in the 1950s, and we're talking about the years when what was good for Ford was good for the U.S. and vice versa, or GM.
General Motors.
Yeah. So even at the peak of its might, manufacturing was employing 1/3 of the U.S. workers. Right now, depending on how you define it, a generous definition of the innovation sector probably would include around 8 to 10% of the U.S. workforce. And that includes not just high tech, but includes many other parts of the workforce that are doing innovative jobs. It will never be 50% of our jobs, but it doesn't have to be 50% of our jobs. It only needs to employ 1/3 of the workforce that it's what economists call the traded sector, the sector that sells goods and services outside the nation and therefore brings in wealth that then is spent in local services. Now, the share of local service jobs has been growing steadily, in part for the reasons that Hal was talking about, and will probably keep growing. Will probably be between 60 and 75%, depending on the region.
Yeah, I have to agree with my esteemed fellow panelists. In terms of the national challenges, right, 20 million new jobs, hard for the tech sector to fill that. I think on a regional basis, though, if you look around here, it's going to be a tremendous driver, and perhaps other regions in the country. But if you look in aggregate, it's it's going to have to be other jobs that really fill the rest of the pie.
Well, the other jobs being ones that sort of spin that are spillovers, or well, let me just sort of do you want to
Well, I was going to say one thing. I absolutely agree. It's got to be services is where the job growth. It's been that way for 30, 40 years. And we tend to think of services as cooks and waiters and gardeners, but of course there are also the doctors, the lawyers, the accountants, and all this high-level services. The trouble with services is kind of a catch-all occupational category. It has a great range of skills, training, income, et cetera, within that the category, but the job growth really has to come from that sector. But I think the important distinction Enrico made is there are jobs that are localized to a sector, and then there are jobs that are tradable from given areas to other areas, and it's those jobs, which could be the manufacturing jobs, or could be the high-tech jobs, or could be other jobs that are creating the local pockets of wealth.
So you mentioned the gap both globally and nationally between the jobs that what the demand is and then what the supply is. Okay, is there a sort of
nominally? I mean, the market will clear somehow, but yeah.
The market will clear somehow. Okay. Coming from D.C. at this point, that's the politicians and the policymakers have a hard time with that sentiment. Okay. I mean, the question. See, what I'm looking at this point is I'm looking at a world in which
There is job growth in the tech sector. There is a demand for people in the tech sector. It's the only thing that's really kind of growing at this point, job-wise. Okay? There's very little other things in the U.S. If you look at the occupation, there isn't very much other growth, okay, outside the healthcare sector. Right? You sort of say healthcare, you say tech, you've pretty much accounted for everything that's going on. So if you were a policymaker at this point, what would you do?
Well, for my sins, I once was in government, and I will stipulate that we do not institutionally provide policy guidance. But let me throw out some options that you might want to think about. Number one is providing transparency into where the demand really is for jobs. That's something that really doesn't exist in a way that's effective. It's unclear that people who are making educational decisions, even an individual student or someone who's trying to make a lifelong learning decision, knows where the demand is going to be.
I'm going to stop you right here. Okay, so every time on this panel that I sort of point out that the tech sector might be sort of driving growth, people kind of resist this. Okay, there's a resistance to sort of saying that this is going to be an important source of job growth. Right? That's positive.
Not at this end. Yeah, not at this end.
Okay, so if I was to sort of go to a college student, okay, for example, my son who has just graduated, okay, and sort of say, well, this distinguished panel of people say there's going to be an increase, but they're not going to tell you that there's going to be a continued job boom in tech jobs or in STEM jobs, okay? What would you be willing to tell them at this point? Because I can tell you what I would be willing to tell them. I'd be willing to sort of say to them that we have a technologically based society which is going to continue to demand these kind of skills. And that in fact, when the Census Bureau reports that people who major in computer science make more than anybody else over the course of their lifetime, that this is something that you can actually count on. Okay. So my question to you, and I apologize for being provocative, but why won't you say this to them?
I will say that there's a boom in STEM jobs. I will quote Hal, who says, those statisticians will be their sexy job in the next 10 years, right? So, but those jobs aren't all going to be in, quote, the tech sector.
That's fine. I'm not saying the tech sector. I'm saying tech-type jobs.
No, this is a very important distinction, and I think that may be part of the issue here, is that I think the whole economy is becoming more technified, to make up a word. Mark Andreessen talked about how software was embedding itself in more and more parts of the economy. So it's not just the traditional tech sector, but if you look at retailing, what's happened there, you look at manufacturing, you look at banking, you look at distribution, and soon education, not soon enough, each of those are becoming much more computer and software intensive, and the characteristics of them are changing, not just in terms of hiring more STEM grads, but Andy and I did some work on what's happening to the nature of competition. In these other industries, it's becoming much more Schumpeterian, where there's much more turbulence, there are more winner-take-all markets. The kinds of characteristics we've seen in the internet sector and the software sector are now common in the other sectors of the economy, much more so than they were 30 years ago. I think it's because those sectors have become technified.
Yeah, another technified point, right? I mean, some people say soon, chief marketing officers are going to spend more on IT than CIOs.
Mm-hmm. So, right. If you look at by function, you could look at different functions. The same thing in marketing, finance.
Do your marketers at that point need tech skills?
Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely.
What's the tech? Yes.
Because I'm concerned now. I'm concerned with the question about what we tell our students. Because you started with transparency. That's why I interrupted you. And transparency, because right now in Washington, you're not actually getting the message to people that...
Here, let me throw out a provocative one, just to be provocative, too. Let's stop teaching calculus. Let's teach a lot more statistics. It's not totally true. I think calc is still valuable, right? But which skill really matters in business, right? Is it understanding,
Absolutely.
Uncertainty, dirty data, making decisions based on probability and conditional probability and bias in samples, et cetera, or is it integrate?
If you want your kids to be sexy, you should teach them statistics.
Well, let me tell you. Let me tell you what Nate Silver said. I interviewed Nate a few weeks ago, who wrote the blog for the New York Times and did the election forecasting that you all may be familiar with. I said, "How did you get into this area?" He said, "Well, if I hadn't outlawed online poker, I'd probably still be doing that." Because it uses all the skills you just described as well. So the
You're
good
not suggesting that people become online poker players.
I just saw an elementary statistics book called Introduction to Probability Using Texas Hold'em.
I bought that book.
So I want to sit for a second with transparency, because I actually think transparency and the connection between, because one of the things that sort of drives me nuts is when I see the Census Bureau figures. So I've got two kids. One of them is majoring in psychology. Okay, well, psychology is the one that comes up at the lowest on the. And the question is, so what do we want to tell the kids who are getting an education, not just a college education, but an associate's degree? What do you want to tell them? What can you tell them that's persuasive about where the growth is going to come from and what they should be learning? Transparency here, okay? And conversely, if I get a senator or a congressman in a back room somewhere, okay,
Don't let them out.
no, that's not going to happen. Okay, what should I tell them? Okay, because what should I tell them about where the growth is? Should I tell them that we're not going to have manufacturing growth and they should just basically teach everybody statistics? Okay, what should I tell them?
Let me quote an authority on this. Barbie. Barbie said, "Math is hard." And she was right. It is hard, I think. It is hard because it's hard. Not everybody can do it, and not everybody has the perseverance to do it, and not everybody invests the effort. And so you have a scarcity premium from having something that people find hard. And so what I would say advise your kids is take at least one hard subject every semester, because then you'll get something that's hard. There won't be as many people who have put the effort in that you do, and that will have some scarcity value. The secret is to be an expensive complement to something that's becoming cheaper and cheaper. And what's becoming cheaper and ubiquitous is data. And what's the complement to the data? It's an analyst, a person who can get meaning out of that data. And so that's why I think statistics is going to be the sexy job of the next decade, because we've got all of this data. Everybody's put in a data warehouse. Everybody has data on tap. And the challenge is, how can we use this data to improve the way our economy operates, our business operates, our society operates?
Math is hard, agreed. But that being said, other countries are graduating twice,
Yes.
STEM graduates at
Yes.
twice the rate that we are. Now, I'm not saying we should copy all of the educational schemes in other countries, but again, Germany's at 28%, Korea's at 35%, China's at 42%, we're at 14%. I mean, unless our guys are dumber.
No,
and guys is
those-
I meant that in a
people are
neutral,
willing to work harder.
gender-neutral guys, but yes.
Now, do you see this as a way to sort of generate more jobs in the U.S. economy in the long run? Or in the short run? See, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to address Eric's problem, okay? No, your real problem, Eric.
No.
Okay, trying to address Eric's problem at the same time thinking about this in a Washington framework. Okay? If I was to sort of tell them what a good policy would be at this point, to sort of unite the growth in tech jobs with the lack of job growth in other parts of the economy, with the exception of healthcare. What am I telling you?
Well, let me make one point about this STEM jobs. Is this multiplier of 5 that we heard about from Enrico applies just as well if you import somebody from Germany or India or China as it does if you home grow them. So it's true that the STEM jobs are going to be good. I think they'll have a multiplier even if we have a a more open immigration policy. And if you talk to everybody in Silicon Valley, they complain about the immigration policy. So one way to get a boost in employment for those local services jobs is to import some of these STEM workers. But the long-run solution is, I think we have to be educating the STEM workers as well. And it's hard to convince a college sophomore to take this tough course when there's this easy course that they find available. But that's what it takes.
$500,000 though.
I know, I understand. They've got to learn that, and they've got to see the examples to motivate them.
People who get poor by not taking the right courses. Okay, I think what I would have, people learn by somebody else's experience. We're going to have a quick lightning round here where we're going to give one proposal that they would sort of tell if they could sort of transmit either to the national government or to the state and local government that would that might make a difference in sort of uniting the tech job increase with a larger job increase.
Well, I'm just going to build on this theme of education. I think that we need to reinvent education, not just invest more in it, but to apply the technology that's transformed all those other industries to the way we do education to make it easier for it to be distributed at a low cost, but also create a learning model for the teachers so they can understand better what's working and what's not working, the kind of things you see in Khan Academy and edX and Udacity and other areas. And I'm hopeful that this time it'll be for real, that we have that reinvention.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have two things. One is transparency to demand for high-skilled jobs, whether it's statisticians or technology or whatever. Second one is we cannot give up on the low-skilled, this millions of people who will be low-skilled and need jobs, and whether or not it's Downton Abbey, some type of, professionalized, personalized home services, health care, elder care, we need to create those jobs too.
I would have to say R&D tax credit. There is growing evidence, solid academic evidence that once a firm innovate and spend money in R&D, obviously benefits from that innovation, but also its competitors, especially those that are located nearby, learn from that innovation and also benefit. There's a wealth of new studies by economists at Stanford and LSE that actually quantify that. And that suggests that there's a market failure in the creation of new knowledge, that the innovators capture only part of the benefit that they bring, that they generate. And so, R&D tax credit are one way to internalize that market failure, to correct for that market failure. The problem is that they're way too low relative to the social benefit of innovation. And also they're not permanent. They are year to year, which makes no sense because innovators obviously have, you invest today and you need some payoff in the future. So I would say we need to significantly increase R&D tax credit and to make them permanent. It's not a moral argument. It's not because we want to support a specific sector, but it's because it's in the interest of the U.S. economy to internalize this externality, and it's going to create jobs. Certainly in the long run, hopefully also in the short run.
So in the short term, I would say a smarter immigration policy for high-skilled workers and entrepreneurs. These are job creators, and they will employ the low-skilled workers for exactly the reasons we heard about earlier in the panel. For the long run, it's got to be educational policy to produce more better-trained workers. That's tough for the reasons we described, but I think you have to attack the problem on both fronts.
I think we're now ready to turn to questions from the audience. Which side is first here? All right, let's go for that side.
Hi, Professor Moretti. So I have your book here, and it's a fascinating response to Friedman's "The World is Flat," and I think it's a very thoughtful. In your book, you talk about the three Americas. We've discussed about America number one, great America. Number three, concerning. So I just wanted to get your thoughts about number 2. And if that number 2 is actually in disadvantage with Brazil, Florianopolis, Chile, or other centers of thought like the Bangalore or Israel. Are we at a disadvantage against them or not?
So to bring everybody up to speed, because I'm flattered that you read my book, but probably you're the only one here.
It is a great book. You should read it. And Erik and Andrew have a book too, and you should read that one.
So the 3 Americas that is referring to is, the first America will be the Americas of the brain hubs, these innovation clusters with highly skilled workers and highly innovative employers that are doing better and better and better. The third America is the Flints and Detroits and the Clevelands that are falling apart. They're losing population and falling wages. And the second America is sort of the vast majority of U.S. metro areas that are sort of in between, and they could go either way. They seem undecided on which direction to take, and they have a labor force that is fairly skilled but not very very skilled, and they have a mix of employers, and they don't. There's not a lot of innovation. There's not a lot of creation of new ideas, new products. And salaries have been stagnating. What to do about America number 2? What's clear is that what we're doing now is not working. We are spending about between $40 to $60 billion annually in policies that are designed to attract outside investment to Middle America, and they're not working very well. It's often a zero-sum game where each locality is competing against other localities by offering subsidy to companies to come to that location. But the winners comes at the cost. It's a zero-sum game where the investment was going to go somewhere. It goes to, say, Indianapolis, or it goes to Houston at the expenses of some other city. So I think we should really rethink a lot of the local economic development policies that have been put in place that are benefiting only those companies, but they're not benefiting the communities that end up overpaying to attract jobs to those localities. And we should really focus on attracting skilled workers. That's the key predictor of economic success of the community for the past 20 years, and is likely to be even more important in the next 20 years. So if second America wants to become more like America number 1, the key recipe should be education, education, education.
Thanks. Next question.
Hi, this actually kind of piggybacks perfectly on where you were going, but I've been hearing a lot of reports and reading a lot about how there's a lot of vacancies in specific vocational trades, specifically within the clean tech sector. We've created a lot of job growth for servicing these different solar panels and things like that, but there aren't people skilled and trained in how to service them, manufacture them, and things like that. I'm really curious in hearing, you guys have mentioned that education and getting people specifically to study more within the STEM sector when they're picking their focus, but what about vocation? What are your thoughts on focusing on educating people in that specific sector to help grow the economy?
Okay, vocational jobs you're asking.
Yes.
I don't have recent data on it. It clearly is another type of construction, which people are going to have to be trained on. I think it is a potential option, but there are some challenges in clean tech right now because, amongst other things, shale gas has changed the economics of energy in the U.S. So, that's a challenge from a carbon footprint standpoint. But I think there is some potential there, but I actually wonder about how that's doing right now. I don't have current data on it.
Let me just briefly, I very much agree with the premise of your question. This is one of the areas where the United States has done particularly badly, and there's countries like Germany which have been very effective with their vocational set of programs where people complete K through 12, and then they get vocational training, and Mercedes and BMW and other companies hire them. And it's one of the reasons that they have success in those manufacturing areas. We leave people sort of to fend for themselves, and a lot of them aren't able to match because there isn't the transparency to know which kinds of skills will actually be valued by the marketplace, and they aren't trained. So there may be many people who would be qualified to do those jobs if they got a little bit of training, but there isn't the matching available and the training to do it. That's one of the areas where we have to do this reinvention of education. It's not just in higher education. It's not just K through 12, but it's also vocational, and I'd add a fourth one, which is lifelong learning.
Let me actually just add one thing here which relates to your transparency. So clean tech jobs are not actually all that prevalent right now, but they might be 10 years from now. Our methodologies for doing job forecasting are terrible. Okay? The BLS, everybody looks at the BLS forecasts. The BLS forecasts, they've done their own internal studies, and you can actually do just as well by kind of just doing straight line extrapolation. Okay, this is not saying anything bad about the BLS. It's difficult to do these types of forecasts. But to the degree to which we're going to want people to go into things that are growing, one of the things that economists have to learn is actually how to sort of do better job forecasts. And I think if you sort of ask, for 10-year forecasts of clean tech jobs, you get a wide variety of sort of possibilities.
Let me just suggest that forecasting is great, but what a lot of, and the more better we can do it, the better. But if you look at a lot of retailing and manufacturing, they have moved away from forecasting towards rapid response to demand conditions. There may be something similar we can do in the labor market. If we have more of the visibility, people like Reid Hoffman at LinkedIn are trying to create systems whereby people can very quickly realize where the jobs are this year, the next year, the year after. And that may not be as effective for if you need to invest 5 or 10 years in training for a career, but if it's something more short term, that's much easier to do conceptually to get that just-in-time visibility to where those clean tech and other jobs are right now and react to those.
Next question.
Clean tech is a different market if there's a price for carbon.
That's right.
So I've heard a fair bit of conversation now on thoughts on economic or educational policy, but if you look to the history of the growth of the Silicon Valley and what drove the Bay Area, it was access not only to the educated workforce, but also access to capital. And investment policy, whether it's governmental tax codes or just whatever it takes to drive investment policy, it seems to me at least that the investment behavior in the risk capital sector of the market has gone through a tremendous change in the past 5 or 8 years. And much of what we're describing is absent from the dialogue of the people with the capital that are investing in companies now. The growth prospects they look for, much like the conversation on the LinkedIn education, what the capital investor, the capital source in the market is looking for today is not a technology development roadmap, but a 6-month cash roadmap. And what is the prospect for the tech sector going forward in the 2020 horizon if nobody's doing technology funding and technology development, but only looking to capitalize on the existing technologies?
Well, one factor you left out, which I think is very important, is the role of defense in innovation in the tech industry, and it played a very, very large role. I mean, the Internet came out of DARPA with the driverless car, which Google has publicized quite a bit. That was a 10-year project by DARPA funding 10 universities to develop the technology for driverless cars. And Google came in and added some very important features based on Street View and Google Maps, and was able to bring that technology to the verge of commercial success. The next thing that's coming, I'm quite sure, is robotic surgery, because DARPA has had a 10-year project in that. And drones, which also we know it was developed by the military initially, does have many civilian applications, which we'll see in the next several years. Well, if we, would like to have a more peaceful world, I think all of us could agree on that, but you have to observe that the military in the past has pushed a lot of technology. It's been the source of a lot of this patient money that you're describing, these 10-year investments that is very hard to find in the private sector.
I might challenge the premise a little bit. I mean, I think the funders have complained about the entrepreneurs. Nobody's working on the hard fundamental problems, right? You guys promised me cars on the moon, and I got 140 characters and all that type of stuff. And the entrepreneurs say, I can't find patient capital. No one wants to fund the fundamental stuff. So it's hard for me to say in the years that I've been around here that dynamic has changed all that much. I mean, there's interesting stuff, more angel stuff, and all those sorts of things. It's hard for me to say that. I will say, though, one of the things that makes this place really special. I mean, we have world-class universities, we have world-class talent, we do have access to capital. There are people in Sand Hill Road who do want to invest in companies, et cetera. But but that stuff people are trying to replicate all over the world. I think one of the powerful things we have here is this dense web of personal interconnections, right? I mean, if I go into a restaurant like, downstairs, right, people are going to be talking about this stuff. Y Combinator's a few blocks away. And I think that's a lot of the secret sauce, which other places don't have yet. Not that they don't get, but they don't have that yet. How many meetups are going on tonight other than what we're doing here? And so I think that's what's really powerful about this place, in addition to the fact that it's tech-based and our multiplier is high and all that type of thing. And I think that's the magic that we have to keep happening here. I think funding is still there. I really do.
Let me just add one more thing to that. If I look, I'm with you, Michael. I don't see so much of a funding problem. But in areas like biosciences, there's a regulation issue. Okay, so there's a lot of areas here where you run into either regulatory roadblocks or sort of obstructions, or things that just take a lot longer because they have to sort of go through a long process. And then there's a real question about whether or not there's regulatory bottlenecks at places like the FDA. Now, the FDA, as it turns out, has a very hard time dealing with productivity-enhancing innovation. So there's a whole set of innovations that would be very logical to sort of invest in that the investors know are going to have a hard time getting approved at the FDA end. Right now, the FDA is grappling with the idea of M-Health. Which apps are going to have to go through the sort of intense FDA process for approval. And where they draw the line is going to matter for where the investment goes in. So I'm not sure. I think in some sense whatever the capital problem is maybe being partly a shadow of the regulatory problem. Next question. We're on the other side here. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised I haven't heard anything about what I think is a key part of the future infrastructure, which is broadband, especially since we have Hal on the panel here. Where are we? Where do you think we are as a country in terms of broadband, and where we're going in the future, and where does that place us in global competitiveness? Because Australia and a number of other countries are investing in broadband, and it seems like we're falling behind, partly for maybe the structure of that industry as an oligopoly. But I would love to hear what the panel thinks about the importance of broadband and what you see where we're heading with that.
Well, since you mentioned my name, I'll say a few things about it. When you look cross-country, you really have to be very careful about what the existing infrastructure look like, because there's a certain amount of leapfrogging going on. We build out cable in the U.S., and so we can provide Internet service through cable, and it's pretty good, really. But a country that didn't build out cable, like Italy, for example, they were doing DSL over the phone lines and satellite TV. Then they can put in fiber. All right, so fiber is going to be a lot better, and the problem in the U.S. is we've got a pretty good technology now, and do we want to spend that money to replace it with a really good technology? And the alternative is spectrum policy that makes more sense. I mean, we could have a much more intelligent spectrum policy in the U.S. There's a lot of bandwidth out there. If you're using LTE from Verizon or AT&T, you know what I mean? It's really quite impressive, the kind of bandwidth you can get if you use some of the newer wireless technologies. So my guess is you have to have the fiber to make the wireless work well in terms of the backhaul. But I think we're going to see the biggest action in the U.S. on the wireless side, in my opinion.
The wireless in the U.S. is pretty good compared to the high-speed wireless is pretty good compared to other places at this point, partly for the leapfrogging.
Partly for the leapfrogging, exactly. When you have a pretty good system in one country, the incremental cost for the incremental value may not look so attractive. And so, you know, you're going to see this happen around the world where there will continue to be a mix of technologies, and we may be lower on the list in broadband and higher on the list in wireless broadband. Some other country has a different mix, so it just depends on the way your particular telecom infrastructure develops.
Next question.
Hi. I want to go back to our earlier discussion about education. I think one trend that really shows sort of the intersection between education and technology is recently there's been the rise of free online education, massive open online courses, things like Coursera, for example, which partners with Wharton, MIT, Stanford, et cetera. So I just wanted to get what are your thoughts on these companies like Coursera, for example, and how sustainable are they as a alternative to traditional education, which is very expensive compared to these?
Well, I'll say a little bit about it. So MIT has something called MITx that's done with Harvard and Berkeley that created a edX program. There's Coursera, there's Udacity, there's the Khan Academy I mentioned earlier at the K through 12 level. Personally, I'm actually extremely optimistic about this. People have been talking about bringing online education for over a decade, but having spent a little time working with the people who are doing these, I'm very encouraged, not just because this is bringing education to a lot more people, but as I suggested earlier, I think the real interesting thing is the way it's creating a closed-loop learning system where people can understand better what works for education and what doesn't work. Our friends in advertising have been optimizing how to get people to click on ads with great success. And I know some super smart statisticians and data scientists they're doing that. And I talk to them, why are you doing that? And they say, well, this is where the data is. We have a ton of data about what people are clicking on. Now, finally, we're getting a lot of data on people who are learning online and what works for learning and what doesn't, how you teach the quadratic equation that people get it and which ways people don't get it. And you can iterate on that, and that's going to create not just a higher level of productivity and performance, but I think more importantly, a higher growth rate, a higher improvement rate over time as we figure out which things are working. And so the platforms that I think are going to be most successful are the ones that are most flexible to allow different ways, different delivery styles, different testing styles, and even customizing and personalizing it to individuals who undoubtedly vary a lot from person to person. And just as we've seen a revolution in music and media and news and all these other industries, I think we're in the beginning of a revolution in education.
I'm going to just step in here for. If we think about this revolution in education, okay, does this end up, I'm going to go back to the original question, does this end up help resolving the job question? Does it make it easier for people to sort of learn what they need to learn to become productive? Does it reach down to the people who don't have a college education at this point? Because I'm sort of...
For sure. I mean, this can MITx is free, and a lot of these other Coursera, a lot of those courses are free too. There's charges for testing and certification that are coming, but it could be much, much more widely available. And that is absolutely, there's this great book, The Race Between Technology and Education. I should mention that title on this panel by Claudia Golden and Larry Katz, which talked about how all through the 20th century, actually even the 19th century, the reason America had such high growth rate is because we had the most educated population and more importantly, the most rapidly increasing education of the population. That stopped happening about 20 years ago. We are no longer the most educated country, and and by some measures, the people who are in their 20s today are less educated than their parents, which has never happened before in hundreds of years. So we've got to reverse that, and the only way to do that, I think, is not just by spending more on education, although that would probably be a good thing to do, but it's by having this productivity improvement. It's also going to lead to some big changes in the way education, the industry of education. I think it's going to become much more of a winner-take-all group where schools like perhaps Wharton and certainly MIT are going to be in a position to
Don't forget Berkeley.
And Berkeley. Maybe even Stanford. But there will be a lot of schools that also, and maybe MIT will be one of them, that struggle in that new world. So that will be a part of the transformation as well, but that's probably a healthy thing.
Next question.
Yeah, I haven't heard any real discussion of income inequality, and that certainly seems to be a very big elephant in the Bay Area.
I think there's been an implicit discussion in terms of discussing who's been falling and coming ahead and who's been falling behind. Do you want to add more?
Sure. Probably the most important development in the U.S. labor market over the past 30 years has been a vast increase in the demand for highly educated workers and a vast decline in demand for less educated workers. And I think that's at the heart of the increase in income inequality nationwide as well as in the Bay Area. A lot of people focus on the 1%, 99% division. I think the real division is the difference between the 35% of workers with a college degree or more and the 65% of workers with an high school degree or less. The first group, since 1980, workers in the first group, their wage has increased by about 30%. Workers in the other group, the less skilled workers, their wage has declined by 15% in real dollars. Okay, so for the 65% of workers who don't have a college degree, their real wage has declined 15%. So these two numbers, to me, are the key facts to keep in mind when you think about inequality. It's not really about, in my view, it's not really about the 1% or the 0.1% or the billionaires, the Mark Zuckerbergs or the CEOs or the hedge fund managers. It's really about average workers with a college degree versus average workers with a high school degree. And so in that excellent book, the race between education and technology that was mentioned earlier, the main point there is that while the demand for skill for highly educated workers was increasing, the supply was not keeping pace. And that's really the capital sin of the U.S. Education and social policy of the past 30 years, that there were not enough support for college education and high school education to keep pace with increased demand. And that ultimately generated increase in
So I agree with the importance of what economists call skill-biased technical change, and especially during much of the 20th century with that book talked about. But as I mentioned briefly in my opening remarks, there's at least two other kinds of technical change that I think are at least important, and I have to disagree that that's still the most important one. I wrote some papers on skill-biased technical change, but I have to say that today, capital-biased technical change and, more important, what I'll call superstar-biased technical change is more important. If you look at what's happened in the past 10 years, about 65% of the total GDP growth has gone to less than 1% of the people. So it's not so much in college-educated people, the rest of the college-educated people have had roughly stagnant wage growth. So there really has been a pulling away of a relatively small group. Just if you look at the numbers, that's not true in the 1990s and 1980s, but if you look at the past decade. And similarly, there's been the shift between capital and labor in terms of the shares of the economy. All three of those, skill-biased technical change, capital-biased technical change, and superstar-biased technical change, they all lead to increased inequality, as you've been suggesting. And it's one of the reasons why, although in the 20th century, GDP, productivity, and wages all went up together, in the past decade, they have diverged. And ultimately, this growth in inequality, as you suggest with your question, is at the root of much of the job question that we're talking about here today. because when there's less demand for people with in those three losing categories, then not only do their wages go down, but at some point they drop out of the labor force. They can't find jobs at all. So it manifests itself both in a decrease in what economists would call the price of labor, i.e. wages, but also in the quantity of labor, i.e. The employment to population ratio. Those are all symptoms of the same underlying set of technological drivers.
Well, let me raise one other point. Michael Chui alluded to this in his remarks. Namely, in the last 30 years, 1 billion people in the world have been lifted out of poverty. So suppose we went back to 1980 and we got a distinguished group of economists and said, would it be possible that you would find 1 billion people could be lifted out of poverty, join the world labor force, and unskilled workers in the U.S. would only see a 10% drop in their wage? Well, the economists would all say, no, that would be ridiculous, impossible. How could that ever happen? In some sense, it's amazing that we've done as a country as well as we have, given this remarkable change.
Next question.
So I have engineering degrees, which makes me very fortunate, I guess. Not the right ones, it turns out, for Silicon Valley. But
What are your engineering degrees in?
Industrial engineering.
It's coming back to that.
It's not a bad approach. But I guess my question is, first day engineering school, the dean got up and said, look left, look right. They're probably not going to be there when you graduate. And it turns out he wasn't wrong, because freshman year, in my hardest classes, my easiest classes were some of my friends that weren't in engineering school, hardest classes. So I guess I wonder if they had said now, maybe look left, look right. Yeah, that's math still holds, but what if you're going to pay 1/3 of the tuition they pay? I wonder what the kind of outcome of engineering school enrollments or STEM. I've never heard that term before. How does that change? And I guess maybe just a question on immigration, because a lot of people, and certainly I help run a technology startup company. I'm very lucky to be part of that. So I've tried to bring engineers here, not because we don't try and hire locally. It's because we're incredibly picky. We'll talk to hundreds of engineers from the best schools and say yes to maybe one or two. I mean, we're talking like a percent of highly qualified kind of vetted candidates. So we try and bring somebody from somewhere like in India, and this guy's a Clojure contributor, and you guys probably don't know what Clojure is. I didn't know what it was until recently. It's this kind of new Lisp language, which is what highly scalable systems are written in. Like, this guy is world class. There's no question. It turns out if you're Indian, single, highly educated, chances are a male, you're not coming here unless you get an H-1B. So I get why we'd want to bring and import this labor, but I guess my question is, what happens in India when that guy comes here?
So it's a great question, and let me recommend Annalise Saxenian's book on the New Argonauts, which is about the role of immigration in Silicon Valley. And we've heard a lot about the forces that helped make Silicon Valley what it was, but what it is today. But one of the really big forces is immigrants, and it was basically immigrants from Taiwan and from India. And it was that pool of labor that was able to create the kind of success story that we see. Now, what happened with many of those workers? Well, some of them went back to Taiwan and created another Silicon Valley or chip manufacturing capability in Taiwan. Some of them went back to India and created the Bangalores of the world. So Annalise Saxenian has said we don't need to worry about brain drain. Emigration means a completely different thing now than it did 40 years ago in the age of the internet and the 747. It's really brain circulation that makes the world work. And it's that brain circulation that the India is getting out of sending that engineer to Silicon Valley.
Well, I think that we've come to the end of our time here. I want to give a big hand for our panelists.
I'd like to thank our speakers for sharing your insights and your perspectives so candidly, very meaningful. As a small gesture of our gratitude, we have for you two things. First, the prestigious Churchill Club speaker T-shirt.
Oh, wonderful.
Next, the handy USB drive from Wharton.
All right.
Please enjoy those. There will be beverages served until 9 o'clock. So if you'd like to stick around and continue discussing, please feel free to do so. This program will be available on Churchill Club's YouTube channel tomorrow or the next day, so feel free to pass along the word there. Certainly want to thank Doug Collum and Wharton for hosting this, and you have been a wonderful audience. Thank you so much. Have a great night.
We could have gone on for another hour. Yes, I did. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Very. Okay, thank you. That was fun.